Hopefully by the end of today's workshop, you'll have learned some tips on making your resume the most effective it can be, whether you have a rough draft or you've never put one together, wherever you are. Hopefully you'll learn some valuable tips, because your resume is often the first impression that you're going to give to a potential employer. And so this idea of passing this 10-second test, you have a very limited amount of time to make a really strong first impression. And so today I want to focus on how you can do that and how you can make your resume stand out. So it takes a lot longer for you to write your resume than it will for somebody to read through it, which is sometimes discouraging. But the more time you put into writing it, the more likely it is going to kind of pass that 10-second test and make a good impression. So I think sometimes people misunderstand the purpose of resumes. They think I need to list every single thing I've ever done, and I need to I need the resume to get the job. But really, the resume is meant to just give a snapshot of your most recent and most relevant experiences, educational background, accomplishments. So it's not everything you've ever done, because again, people aren't going to spend a long time reading through the resume. So you want to focus on what's most recent, what's most relevant. And the resume isn't going to be what gets you the job. You can look perfect on paper, but if you don't do well in the interview, you aren't going to get the job. So the resume gets your foot in the door. It gets you the interview, and then you have to interview well to get the job. So a quick true or false quiz. A resume should always be one page. How many of you would say true? I see like, maybe. How many would say false? Okay, and this maybe is a little trick question. It depends. Most of the time, especially for students, we would say yes, your resume should ideally be one page. Because again, you want to make it as brief and concise as possible. Make sure somebody can quickly scan through it. Now, of course, with everything, there's exceptions. If you have a lot of experience, you've done multiple internships, a lot of things, involvement at Calvin that are really relevant to what you're applying for, and it goes to 2 pages, that's okay. Or sometimes, later on in your career, more than one-page resume is acceptable. But for the most part, you want to try to keep it as concise as possible. Okay, another true or false question. You should always use the same version of your resume for every job opening. How many would say, yes, that's true? Nobody. How many would say false? Good job. Passed the quiz. What would be an example? Can anybody think of an example of how you might change your resume based on a job you're applying for? Yeah.
Experiences that you put based on what they're looking for?
Yeah, so describing your experiences or what experiences to include depending on the job. So as an example, when I was in grad school, I worked at the YMCA just as a way to earn some money. I worked in their teen center, so I sold concessions and played games. Like, it wasn't relevant at all to a career coach position. But one of the things I did when I was there is I created a job shadowing program for the teens. And so that's what I put on my resume, describing that experience, because that's more relevant to a career coach job that I was applying for. So think about what you can, how you can describe your experiences or what experiences to include that will be most applicable to the jobs you're applying for. Now, with resumes, you may sometimes hear conflicting advice, and sometimes students will come to me and they say, well, my professor told me this, but now you're saying something different. Resumes are very subjective, but I am going to give you some pretty standard guidelines that our office recommends, but that we also hear from employers. But ultimately, the resume is yours, and you get to decide the best way that you want to present your experiences. But just some general guidelines to keep in mind. Yes, you ideally want to have one page like we talked about, but again, there are exceptions to that. But make it one full page. Just as bad would be having a half-page resume than having too long of a resume, because then people are thinking, well, what have you been doing besides going to class? So make it one full page. Keep it pretty simple. in terms of formatting. It doesn't have to look real fancy. It doesn't need a lot of colors or images unless you're going into some sort of design field. But generally, pretty straightforward and simple. And make sure you're consistent. So for instance, with punctuation, if you have periods at the end of all of your bullet points, then make sure there's a period at the end of all of your bullet points, not periods on this section and not on this section. Just make sure it's consistent. You also want to use easy to read fonts. Pretty standard Times New Roman, Arial, Calibri, and a 10 to 12 size, because that's going to be easier to read. Of course, be honest. Anything that you put on a resume is fair game to be asked about in an interview. And so if you list a club that maybe you went to one meeting, and then they ask you about it in an interview, just think about how you might respond to that. So be honest, don't exaggerate your experiences, but just be clear about what you've been involved in and the depth of your involvement. Make sure to keep things concise. Again, that whole idea of, you have a very limited amount of time to make a good impression. So you don't want to use long paragraphs and sentences, but really brief and concise. Use action words, kind of an active way of describing your experiences. And really important to proofread or have somebody else review your resume. We have walk-in hours every day in career development where somebody can sit down with you, read through your resume, give you feedback. Because sometimes if you meet all of the qualifications for a job, but you have one typo on your resume, that may be reason for you to be disqualified from a position. So very important to proofread, make sure it's error-free. So with the resume, again, it's going to be unique to you, unique to your experiences, but there are some possible components. So you may have all of these sections on your resume. You may only have some of them. It's going to depend on what you choose to include. So I'm going to go through each of these sections in a lot more depth, what to include, what not to include. And feel free, if you have questions as we go along, feel free to jump in. But starting with contact information, you might think, well, this is obvious. Why are we spending time talking about putting your name and contact information on a resume? But you would be surprised how often I have to correct people or make suggestions in this area. Recently, I was submitting some resumes for an opportunity, and someone hadn't put a phone number or email address on their resume. Well, how do you expect a potential employer to contact you if you don't include that information on the resume? So make sure, obviously, to be complete in the contact information that you include. You also want to make sure your name is a little bit larger than the rest of the font in the resume. Make sure that stands out a little bit. Of course, you want to include an email address. We would suggest even using a non-Calvin email address if possible, or create a non-Calvin email account if you don't have one, because your Calvin email address is not going to be good forever. I think it's good maybe 6 months after you graduate. And so it's good to kind of have a professional email account established and make sure it's professional sounding. We've had recruiters tell us before, cute as a cupcake at gmail.com, or I love my puppy. I mean, those are not professional sounding email addresses. It's just something simple with your name would be appropriate. Phone number, make sure that you think about if somebody were to call you and you're not available, what are they going to hear? So if it's your cell phone, do you have a professional voicemail greeting? If you're leaving a home number, is someone going to be reliable in taking messages? So think about that in terms of the phone number that you list and what a recruiter will hear when they call you and they don't reach you. And then mailing address, it's not as crucial because people are probably not going to contact you by mail anymore. But sometimes, it can be good to list the mailing address just to show you're from that area. You can choose if you want to include both your school address and your home address. It's up to you. Like I said, not as crucial, but still pretty standard to include those on the resume. Another optional part of a resume is called an objective statement. I would say objectives are actually kind of starting to go away, or not as popular, or recruiters might not even really like them that much because they don't tell them that much about your experience. But if you choose to include one, make it concise. So an objective would be something like what type of position you're looking for, what kind of skills you hope to bring to that position. So it could be something like to obtain a summer internship in order to contribute strong communication and interpersonal skills. So that's very concise. It's clear about what position you're looking for and also what you can bring to the position. So that's using kind of that employer-focused language, how you're going to meet their needs, not something like to obtain an internship so I can gain experience. That's more self-focused. So again, this is optional. It's sometimes, like we say, better to avoid having it because employers don't always really pay that much attention to them. And sometimes people are so specific in their objective that they actually make a mistake where they list the company they're applying to, and then they end up submitting that to a different company. Well, automatically, that's going to be kind of disqualifying you from a position. So it's optional, your choice, but we generally try to say might be better to avoid it. Sometimes what's becoming more common than an objective is what's called a profile or a summary of qualifications. You'll see it called different things on different resumes. Again, still optional. And it's less about the type of position you are seeking and more, these are my strengths, these are my qualities, kind of intangible things that you would bring to the position. So this is just an example of a profile statement for an education student. So highly motivated and dedicated educator who strives to ensure that all children are successful learners. Demonstrated ability to individualize instruction based on students' needs and interests. So it's highlighting that education student's strengths, experience, just kind of a summary statement at the top of the resume. So next would be education. And we recommend for current students, recent grads, education should be close to the top of the resume. Sometimes you'll see with more experienced professionals, education moves more to the bottom, but we think it's important to highlight your education. And so highlight that closer to the top of the resume. And what you want to include with the education is name and location of college. So Calvin College, Grand Rapids, Michigan. What degree you're working on, so your major, your minor, when you expect to earn that degree. Your GPA, general recommendation is to include it if it's 3.0 or above. If not, you can leave that off. And other things you might include in an education section would be if you've done any study abroad or interims abroad, maybe related courses. List the course names, not the course numbers. People outside of Calvin won't really know what Business 160 is or whatever the case may be. So if you want to list names of courses, sometimes that shows what experiences you've had. Yeah?
If you're an honors student, where do you put the honors?
That could be just another line in the education student. So honors program or honors student, you could list it there. Mm-hmm. Any other questions with education? Generally, I would say leave high school information off unless there's something really unique you want employers to know. So if you went to an international school or if you were a valedictorian, then maybe you could still include it. But generally, employers are more interested in your college experiences. Yeah?
What if there's you have your major GPA and then you have your overall GPA?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is, what about your GPA within your major and your overall GPA? You can list both of them, or if your major GPA is maybe significantly higher than your overall GPA, then you could list that. But just be clear on the resume that it is your GPA within your major. So you could say GPA within major or major GPA. just so it's clear, you're not misleading. But if they're pretty close, I would say just put your cumulative GPA. But again, if there's kind of a significant difference, you could choose to list the higher one. Yeah.
You went to two colleges. You listed the top one as the one you graduated from?
Yeah, so generally in a resume, you want to, within each section, you start with most recent. So if you're currently at Calvin, you would start with Calvin. And it's again, up to you if you want to list, if you transferred to Calvin and you're earning your degree from Calvin, you don't have to list the other college. But if you want to show, you went there for a couple of years, you took classes in these areas, then you could list it, but it would go underneath Calvin. Good questions. Any questions about education? Okay, the bulk of your resume is probably going to be the experience section. And experience can be paid work experience, or it can be volunteer work, or even class projects. It's purposely called experience so that it's a broad heading. So within each section, again, you want to start with the most recent, so maybe things you're currently involved in or have recently been involved in. And each experience you want to format the same way. So you want to talk about what your title or your role was in that experience, what the company or organization was, where it's located, the dates that you were a part of that. And then the bulleted list is kind of describing that experience. But again, you're not writing in complete sentences, but more just brief phrases. Start those bullet points with verbs. And try to think beyond just the tasks of that job, but what did you accomplish, or what was the result of something that you did there? Or what were some transferable skills? So if you were a server in a restaurant, you're applying for something totally different, what kind of skills did you gain in that role that would transfer into another position? So things like providing customer service, or working with a team, or working in a fast-paced environment. Think about how you can describe experiences that might not be as relevant in ways that show you have skills that would transfer, that would be valuable in another type of setting. And kind of just another example of describing your experiences so that it goes beyond just the task or the responsibility. Think about if there's any way you can quantify things. Sometimes that helps show more of the accomplishment. So this kind of gives some examples. See what obviously is a little bit stronger of a statement. Is it kept inventory or managed daily inventory of over 1,000 types of supplies? Yes, it's a little bit longer, even though I'm telling you to be concise, but it gives more of an idea of the depth of the work that you were doing and the impact that you had with that particular employer. So when potential employers see that, they start to think, well, if you did that for that employer, I wonder what you might be able to do for us and how you might make an impact here. So sometimes quantifying things, or again, just trying to emphasize the result or the impact or the accomplishment more so than just the task or the responsibility. Other possible components of a resume, again, it's up to you what you want to include. Sometimes people will include a skills section, and this would be for more tangible skills, things like languages, computer programs, maybe certain certifications. So this isn't a place where you would put things like organization or communication. Those are more intangible. Those don't necessarily need to be on the resume, or if you do include them, maybe put them in that summary or that profile at the beginning. But again, if you have a skills section, it should be more tangible things that you list there. Other sections might be activities. So if you've been really involved on campus, student organizations, or volunteering, or you've gotten a lot of awards or scholarships. Those can be listed on the resume as well. Sometimes I will see like a hobbies or interests section. I would say that's probably maybe the least important thing to include on a resume, but sometimes you may make a connection with a potential employer if you have a similar hobby. And then finally, references. References do not have to be part of your resume unless specifically requested by an employer. I would rather see you use up the space to describe your experiences and your qualifications because references generally aren't contacted until kind of you're further on in the process, so you can always provide them at a later date. I would actually suggest have a separate document, put your name and contact information at the top so it matches your resume, and then list the names and contact information for references. Then you have that ready at an interview or if somebody requests it, but it doesn't have to be part of the resume. So just a few other tips for resumes. Like we've been talking about, you want to make sure it's brief and concise. So even simple things like avoiding personal pronouns or trying to eliminate too many extra words like a, an, or the. Those little things make a big difference in someone's ability to just quickly scan through your document. Also, you want to make sure you're not using jargon or terms that are only going to be familiar to a particular organization. So I often see this with students. They'll list interim in Europe. Well, interim is not really a familiar term outside of Calvin. When I first started at Calvin, I was like, what is interim? I don't get what this is. So I usually tell people, say, study abroad in Europe, January 2016. So just be cautious. You want to make sure you're not using terms that aren't going to be familiar or aren't going to be understood by the potential employers. And also, when you are applying online or when you email your resume to a potential employer, I would suggest converting it to a PDF. That ensures that the formatting stays exactly the way you want it to be, because sometimes if you just send it as a Word document, somebody opens it and the formatting gets all messed up or they don't have the right font. So if you save it as a PDF, it just helps make sure the resume looks the way you want it to look. And I would even suggest saving the document with your name as part of the file name. I get resumes all the time from students just asking for help, and so many of them are just titled resume. But if you want to make it easier for the employer to find a file if they're looking for yours, put your name as part of the file name can be really helpful. So I know it's a lot of information. I hope you guys all grabbed the resume handout on your way in, which gives some of these same tips and also gives you some sample resumes. If you've never done a resume before, we do have a program called Optimal Resume that you can use just as a starting point. It has lots of sample resumes and templates that you can build your resume from. And then, like I mentioned, we do have walk-in hours every day, 11 to 1, that you can bring a copy of your resume in and we can sit down with you and go over it.